Senator Bob Dole has died at the age of 98. Dole was a Kansas native and World War II hero. He ran for president 3 times. Between the military, politics, and his work outside of Washington, Dole spent more than 7 decades in service to his country. While in elected office, he held several key positions, including Senate Majority Leader for the Republican Party. In February of this year, Dole confirmed he had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. President Biden is reacting to the news. In a statement from the White House, he writes, quote, "Bob was an American statesman like few in our history, a war hero and among the greatest of the greatest generation. And to me, he was also a friend whom I could look to for trusted guidance or a humorous line at just the right moment to settle frayed nerves. I will miss my friend." CBS News' Major Garrett has more on the senator's life.
I accept your nomination to lead our party once again to the presidency of the United States.
Bob Dole was the last presidential candidate who served in World War II. And in the '96 campaign, he said America needed more of the greatest generation's grit and values.
And I know because I was there, and I have seen it, and I remember.
But it didn't work. Baby boomer President Bill Clinton painted Dole as a fixture of the past and easily won a second term. Growing up in Russell, Kansas, Dole was a star athlete in high school and joined the Army as a college freshman. He suffered grievous wounds in Italy that would cost him the use of one arm. Neighbors raised money to pay for several surgeries and later sent him to Congress.
When I needed help, the people of Russell helped. And I think
Gerald Ford put Dole on the ticket in 1976. In the vice presidential debate, Dole blamed Democrats for wars on their watch.
If we added up the killed and wounded in Democrat wars in this century...
The backlash hurt Dole and Ford, who would eventually lose to Jimmy Carter. Dole spent 27 years in the Senate, quitting his post as majority leader in an all-out bid to defeat Clinton.
my time to leave this office has come, and I will seek the presidency with nothing to fall back on but the judgment of the people, and nowhere to go but the White House or home.
With that defeat, Dole became the only person to lose as a presidential and vice presidential nominee.
Thank you so much.
6 years later, his wife Elizabeth was elected to the Senate, and he became an unlikely TV pitchman for soft drinks with Britney Spears.
Easy boy.
Courage.
And even Viagra.
Like erectile dysfunction.
When Donald Trump secured the nomination in 2016, Dole became the only living GOP nominee to endorse him.
Donald Trump can win.
Dole was a Farm Belt fiscal conservative. Party loyalty came easy. Culture war rhetoric did not. He wielded power quietly and, over the years, with humor and humility, qualities of what feels like a bygone era of national politics. Major Garrett, CBS News, Washington.
I want to bring in now CBS News political contributor and White House reporter for The Washington Post, Sean Sullivan. Sean, thanks for being here. What impact has Bob Dole had on this country?
Well, he's been a fixture of American politics and governance for many, many decades in a way that we haven't seen many politicians, candidates, office holders do. As somebody who was, of course, the presidential nominee of the Republican Party in 1996, as somebody who served at the highest levels of the Senate, who presided over, sort of a bunch of different periods over the last many decades of American politics and governance. And again, we haven't seen somebody whose career has spanned this long and this many sort of changes in American culture, American policy, the direction that government has gone. And of course, he's also remembered by a lot of people for his service in World War II, somebody who sustained very, very serious injuries at the time that some people thought he was not going to be able to overcome. Some people thought he was not going to be able to, even walk again. And so that became a part of his political identity as well. And, I was looking in my email inbox, Lana, over the last several minutes, and we're seeing a lot of statements pour in right now from different politicians from both ends of the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans. I think you're going to continue to see that today as people pay their respects.
Senator Dole was very much a Republican through and through, a traditional Republican. He once said, as I remember, that he wasn't any sort of hyphenated Republican. He was a Republican. But he also, as you said, made friendships across the aisle. Another quote of his is, "All the wisdom doesn't reside in just one party." Tell us more about that thought about Bob Dole and as you heard Major describe it, potentially the idea of a different time of politics.
Yeah, Lana, it does very much seem like a different time. You know, one of the statements I just saw come through was from Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat, who called him, quote, a giant of the Senate. When you think about politics today, you think about the relationships between Democrats and Republicans, it's sort of difficult to envision somebody who is able to have the kind of relationships that he had. And it really does sort of symbolize the changing times over the last, particularly over the last couple of decades, as we have seen more polarization kick in, we've seen more partisanship kick in, we've seen both sides really dig in against the other. And so, you know, it's hard to envision somebody who has in today's politics, the kind of relationships that Senator Dole had when he was a member of the Senate. And you're right that in many ways he does sort of symbolize this old guard of the Republican Party. And I think a lot of people look at today's Republican Party, they see it as one that they view very differently than the party that Senator Dole presided over as the nominee for president in 1996 as the leader of the Senate. So, you know, when you look at his career, when you look at the relationships he's formed, and you look at the respect he won on both sides, and you look at where we are today in politics, it is a somewhat striking, look at how times have changed over the course of the past few decades.
Dole was also very badly wounded during World War II. Tell our viewers how he talked about the war, how his wounds affected his time in Washington, and some of the work that both he and his wife, the other Senator Dole, did after they left Washington.
Yeah, this was a central part of his identity as an elected official, as a politician. He suffered these very, very serious injuries while fighting in World War II. And then as his career went on, we saw him become an advocate for people with disabilities. We saw him talk a lot about World War II veterans. And so this was something that, you know, when you look at the many things that he did and worked on, when you look at the many campaigns he ran for national office, this was something that he clearly cared a lot about and obviously experienced in a very, very significant way firsthand. I think that's something a lot of people are going to remember as these comments, as these statements come in, remembering Senator Dole not just as somebody who, you know, served as a senator, was a leading politician, but was somebody who was a veteran who sustained his own very, very serious injuries and became an advocate for veterans, became an advocate for people with disabilities throughout his career.
And Sean, you mentioned his presidential campaigns. He ran for president 3 times. He won the Republican nomination in 1996. Tell us a little bit about that campaign.
Yeah, when you look back at that campaign, it was an interesting moment in the history of this country, both politically, culturally, for a number of reasons. And, you know, Democrats for a long time had not found success in federal office. And then Bill Clinton comes along, wins in 1992, sort of charts this new direction for the Democratic Party, this sort of more centrist direction. And then he runs for re-election in 1996, and Republicans feel, you know, is this a chance for them to recapture the White House? Well, in the end, that campaign did not end up being that competitive. Bill Clinton, the incumbent president, won somewhat comfortably if you look at the overall margins, if you look at the states that he won. And, you know, from there, that was sort of the high point of Senator Dole's career. We didn't see him after that sort of emerge as a candidate for national office again after that. But he had continued to be somebody who was still, you know, paying attention clearly to Republican politics. One thing I would note is that unlike a lot of the old guard Republicans, members of the Bush family, others who distanced themselves from Donald Trump's campaigns and Donald Trump's presidency, he was somebody who was a supporter of Trump, didn't support everything that he did and said, but was a supporter. And that was something that made him different than a lot of the old guard Republicans of his era. So even after he ran that campaign, was still somebody who was clearly paying attention, tuning into politics. And that's one thing that I think people will remember as a distinguishing factor is, his support for Trump at a time when others of his generation, of his ideology said, no, I'm not going to support this person.
Sean, tell us more about that, because as you mentioned, for most of the old guard of the Republican Party, there wasn't support for then candidate Donald Trump, and then there was a little bit more, but still not a lot of support for him when he became president. But Senator Dole was out there endorsing Donald Trump in 2016. What led to that endorsement? How did he describe his feelings of support?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at his support for Trump. One thing I was struck by earlier this year was an interview he gave to USA Today, where he said, "Look, I was a supporter of Trump," but he stopped short of saying and agreeing with former President Trump's false assertions that the election was stolen and that there was any fraud, or that he was not the loser of that election. And so he did distance himself from him in that respect. But I think that he liked Trump as a candidate. He sort of liked some of the things that he stood for. I think somewhat surprising, actually, to other Republicans who thought perhaps that he might come out and say something different. We did see over time a lot of different Republicans from the party at various points take a stand against Trump. Some of them took a stronger stand than others, but that certainly was something that set him apart. And I think it's something that people are going to look at as they look at sort of the totality of his life and his career.
All right. Sean Sullivan, thank you.
Thanks.